It's a pleasure to see so many faces on an evening. Please stay safe, and hopefully, I'm going to show you uh, what led me into it. The first session, we've actually designed this to be a two-part session. The first session is basically aimed at showing you what it was that drove me into this passion. I'm not a trained historian, and I landed into this more as a hobby. So, without much ado, I take you on this journey of self-discovery, wherein I share the reasons why I call this the India Pride Project. This is our hashtag which we use. It's called Bring Our Gods Home. Not to sound for us, everything is our ancestral treasure or wealth. And what you're going to see might be some disturbing images. So before we start this session I'd like to dedicate my work, our work, to the unknown artists and sculptors who created these divine works, to the kings and chieftains who supported them in those years, and to the people like you and me who continue to appreciate and enjoy them. My first salute to the creators, the unknown sculptors and the sthapatis, the distilled wisdom of the ancients. What you're going to see, none of the images you're going to see are less than 500 years old. So everything, each and every object you're going to see today are at least 1,000 to 500 years old. So welcome, and I'd like to start this by emphasizing a very important distinction. Our murtis were never meant to be seen as objects of art. What you're seeing, I hail from Tamil Nadu, and we call them Tirumeni, these bronzes. You can actually see this was our latest success. These three bronzes, along with the Hanuman, of course Rama, Lakshmana, Sita, were stolen in 1978 from an under-worship temple. We spotted it with a dealer in London, along with help from the Idol Wing in Chennai, the UK High Commission. We managed to convince the dealer to return the three murtis. We're also working to get back the Hanuman of this pair from Singapore. What you see here is the actual restitution. The London High Commission actually had priests come over and redecorate these murtis, making them murtis from being just showpiece curios. And this is in essence what our work is. These were never destined to be objects of art, to be placed in showpiece curios, to be put a price tag on. And you're going to see what a hefty price tag it is in the coming slides. I also want to introduce you to the concept of buried hoards. This is an often neglected aspect of our history. Around the 13th, 14th centuries, because of a lot of, I would say, invasions and iconoclasts, our ancients actually went through the prescribed texts. And the prescribed texts basically tell us that when faced with armed conflict, save your gods. And how they did it, if they had time, they would basically dig a pit, align it with grass, charcoal, and then bury the murtis. If they don't have time, if the threat is too immediate, they would actually throw them into wells, ponds and lakes and tanks. Of course, with the strong belief that after the threat passes, these murtis would be brought back to worship. But for some reason, and it's a reason where there's a lot more speculation, not too much of being thought about it. Imagine somebody goes through so much of trouble to save their gods, and then once the threats were like hardly 6 months, 8 months. So obviously, the people had time to bring the gods back to worship. But for some reason, even today, every month we find news articles of these buried hoards being found. The only reason I could think of is The custodians were killed or they gave up their lives protecting their secrets where they were buried. And this was the supreme sacrifice our ancients did to protect their gods. And sadly, these are the most trafficked, most smuggled items. As they come out from the soil, most of them are not reported. But this is one success story. This happened last year. Of course, the Nataraja, as he is coming out, and you actually see the people, he's been buried for 600 years in just a little bit of water, and people have already started worshipping. And this is the essence of the reason why so much of sacrifice was done to safeguard them. So I just wanted to introduce the concept of buried hoards to you. So compared to buried hoards, a bronze that is under active worship, this of course is one of the few remaining bronzes in the Tanjore Big Temple bestowed by King Rajaraja Chola, and you actually see the beauty of a bronze that's been under continuous worship. And there's a reason why I'm showing you these two bronzes, a buried bronze versus a bronze that's been under continuous worship. This golden sheen that is there comes from daily worship. Daily worship means these bronzes would be treated as living gods. They would be woken up singing songs, they would be ceremoniously bathed, dried, fed, sung to. Festivals would happen to them, and in the night they would be sung to, and they'll be taken to their bed chambers to sleep. So literally the priest would take care of these bronzes as living beings. Sadly, even today, we don't take care of our murtis properly. These are currently under in temples, which is another subject that we need to establish. Having said that, what is the threat? How big is this art market? And today I'd like to introduce you to this huge art market which is totally unregulated, unpoliced. There are no records, there is no regulations. And what are the kind of monies that we're talking about? This fantastic Pala era, that's Orissa, Bangladesh, West Bengal border, Bodhisattva, was sold for ridiculously high US dollar figure because he had this spectacular provenance, meaning it went before independence out of India. And these are the kind of dollar numbers that are being thrown at our art. And this is the global art market, and this includes fine art as well, so in the coming slides. But you can actually see the market has doubled probably. And again, I would like to highlight that this is coming from random sampling questionnaires. This is not some industry data that can be relied upon. Even a rough sampling shows that the art market is doubling in a decade. And who are the main players? Of course, the main players are the erstwhile colonial powers, the UK and the EU, occupying about 25%, the new bosses, the US 40%, and of course China is a very unique market, and they deal predominantly purely in Chinese artifacts, so 20% is in China. So we go drill down into the art and antiquities market. Again, you look at it, it's between the US and the UK, roughly about 60% is between these two markets. And what do they call us? When I say us, I'm classifying India, Greece, Italy, Cambodia. We are looked at as source nations. I'm not joking. They call us source nations as we are some mine where they can, we have ore, our treasures. We are called source nations. And what are the routes that are being used to traffic? So most likely what happens is the trafficking networks have their bosses sitting in Hong Kong. We have seen many cases where the artifacts are misdeclared, willfully underdeclared, declared as garden furniture, declared as brassware, sent to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the buyers fly in, inspect it, make sure it's original, not a fake, and then monies are transferred, and then somehow they reach India through Hawala channels, the balance money, because for customs, they declare very little numbers to fly under the customs radar. And then if they need any restoration, of course we will see in a while what restoration means, they're taken to London, because that's the main area for restoration work. or into Zurich, wherein they're laundered and they come out of Zurich as the property of a Swiss gentleman, which is the biggest joke in the antiquities market. Because Swiss laws are so secretive, you can just go in there and then the objects are brought back into London, New York, and then the auctions go on. So this is, for example, the growth, the US market of cultural property imports. And you can actually see what kind of numbers we're talking about. And for a long time, the US didn't care. No? Anybody could bring anything into the US. But something happened between 2007 and 2008, and as you can see from these slides, the green worm, of course, is Indian art. Across the wide spectrum, around 2007-2008, you see a drastic fall in the open market for antiquities. So what we are discussing here is, again, there is a very large closed market for antiquities, which is even darker. But having said that, what is it that happened in 2007 that drove the market down, at least the official market? We look at that, just keep that thought in your back of your mind. Is this big deal? Is it a big deal? So this was a study, all the references are there below, you can refer them later. Is there an antiquities black market? Experts, archaeologists were asked, 97%, 98% in fact said yes, it exists. 90% said it exists in all countries. About 79% said they've personally experienced looting. Is it? So this is a pan-global problem that happens in every land. And more importantly, what are the causes for this? So apart from subsistence level looters, what we are looking for is fragile borders, which is the biggest problem, which we'll address in a while. But then the question that, for example, most EU law enforcement in the US basically say, your customs are porous, your porous borders. But then we turn back and ask them the same question. A container of Kapoors, who we'll see in a while, valued at $20 million worth of antiquities, were declared as garden furniture, and they were allowed to land in the US. So it's the same thing. Customs is lax both sides. So there's a lot of capacity building that needs to be done in customs. But then in 2008-9, that's when the US started realizing that money laundering, transnational organized crime, and terrorism financing were linked to the antiquities, illicit antiquities market. To put things in perspective, you're looking at in terms of, so this was what was shown to the judge, for example. So in terms of what is the average value for an artifact and how does it transfer to money in the hands of a terrorist and what he would make use of it for. So for people who think this is some fairy tale, is not so. It's a very scary tale, in fact. And what you're seeing here is actually a Daesh controlled territory in 2011 satellite images, and then in 2014 you can actually see it's almost like a golf ball, and all those small holes that you see are illicit rigs which were actually licensed out by Daesh for money. So these were illicit diggers digging out of each of these potholes. What if they ailed? Where did all this money go? A lot of people say, it has never come out in the market, but you have to understand that the antiquities market has very deep pockets. We call it fencing in the art market. I give you this example. There was this British art dealer called Robin Chimes. He was arrested in 2014, and the Greek authorities, the Italian authorities actually raided a free port in Switzerland. And they found a room in the free port, which is basically like your locker, but a room that was not opened for 30 years. So basically Robin Chimes had fenced what you're seeing here for 30 years inside a room, and we're talking about whole sarcophagi and all that, and about $20 million worth of stuff, and he had fenced it for almost 30 years. And there are 55 such free ports around the world. Now, after the Panama Papers, people, of course, with a lot of bad money, don't want to keep money in banks because, leaks do happen. So the easier way out is to launder art. So you can actually transfer ownership inside a free port from one room to another, and you basically transfer $1 million painting or a $5 million sculpture. No questions asked. There are no records. So the free port in Switzerland after this raid agreed. So basically these free ports are like no man has any entry. So basically you come in, you stash, you go. There's no in, there's no out entry. So in 2016, they agreed that they will appoint one of the big four audit firms, basically to keep a record of what is coming and going out, but that will not be made public. So that is the only concession that's happened. So as I told you, what we are talking about is so far was public sales, and what you're looking at here is how the private sales has grown. The light blue is private sales, which is basically private invitations, no catalogs, no exhibitions, no photographs. It's just like a premier event where invites are given to the rich and the famous to come and view objects, and money gets transferred for them. So what happens in these auctions? So what you're seeing here is actually a daily ritual that happens in our temples. As I told you, the murtis are woken up, they are bathed, they are clothed, all the decorations are done, ornaments are worn, and actually the priest is holding up a mirror to the deity so that she can look at it and see if the alangaram, that ornamentation is nice. So this is how the priest basically is treating the deity in his abode. This is from a friend's Facebook share a couple of days ago. Compare that to what happens in a private sales. What you are seeing is actually a private sale wherein our murtis are being displayed for sale, and people are looking at it as though they are showpiece curios with price tags posing in front of it. And this is a rich collector's home, one of the biggest collector's home. And you see our beautiful murtis lining a swimming pool. So this is definitely not the purpose these murtis were intended to be. And so this is one of the main things that drove me to talk about these in a big way. Collecting has been happening, and I like to throw a few colonial era fetishes for people to view. And what you're seeing here again are some beautiful murtis that are part of a buried treasure trove that was found in a Danish colony in South India called Trantaba. Danish collector basically was digging his fort to expand when he found a cache of 30 bronzes, including these beautiful puja items for which only these sketches remain. We don't know where the originals are. The murtis are, however, in the Danish museum. So this is the Danish collector Peter Anker. So what happened was the local people actually cried and asked Peter Anker to return the murtis. He said the powers of the murtis are gone. There are no big temple nearby to take these murtis, which is blatantly wrong, because just behind the wall is a huge 1,000-year-old Chola temple itself. But then when he went back, he basically sold these bronzes to the Prince of Denmark. And in that note, he says, I bought it from the locals. And what is interesting is, what did he pay the locals? For these amazing murtis, Peter Anker gave the locals a bag of rice and some betel nuts. And for a bag of rice and betel nuts, these murtis are currently displayed in the National Museum in Denmark. Another example is this beautiful Vishnu set that is currently in the Victoria and Albert Museum. These were found buried near in the heart of Coimbatore. The temple bid for it in 1898 because the temple, Karivarda Perumal temple, did not have the murtis. They went up to 1,000 rupees, which they collected and tried to bid, but they were outbid by Lord Curzon, the Viceroy. Lord Curzon basically took these and bequeathed it to V&A, where they still are there. Similarly, we have lost a lot of bronzes. These are from the Kalahasti temple, which is near Tirupati. These are very few remaining portrait bronzes of Chola King Kulothunga, his consort, and they were stolen. They were missing since 1930 and never to be seen again. This is also an aspect that we need to take note. We have not seen them for 90 years. They have not been displayed. Where they are, we don't know. There are a lot of these murtis that are also faked, meaning the originals have been stolen, fakes have been kept, and they managed to do this right in front of our eyes because we are not trained to look at them. So in this set of Rama, Lakshmana and Sita, there is one fake. So if you really look at it closely, now that I tell you, the Lakshmana is a modern replica. Rama and Sita are original Chola bronzes. So let's see if you can make this out. Here is another Rama Sita where you can clearly see the Rama is old, the Sita is new. So what is happening to all these bronzes, all these murtis? They're basically being auctioned on the covers and blatantly meaning this was a beautiful bronze that was in the Kailasanatha temple in Kanjivaram. It was with a well-known dancer called Ram Gopal. She was auctioned for almost $1 million, and then there you see the context is all lost. From being the Gauri of Kanchi Kailasanatha temple, she just becomes an important figure of Parvati. Then we have another Pallava period bronze that was sold for almost $500,000, and this beautiful Vijayanagara Parvati sold for $3 million. And we are talking these kind of numbers. And who are the buyers? And why is it that they are so easily buying stuff? Many times when people go to museums, the first question that you should ask is what happened to the legs? Why are the legs in this state? Not only that, if you go to New York, for example, today in the Metropolitan Museum, the first gift, the first exhibit is a gift by Subhash Kapoor, a known smuggle who's been arrested under trial for the last 10 years, and the Met continues to exhibit with no provenance detail these beautiful objects from Chandraketugarh. And Chandraketugarh is a site which was excavated only in 1968. Every museum, every collector has objects from beautiful terracottas from Chandraketugarh, and it's a site that's been pillaged like crazy. So I would request you please Google about Chandraketugarh to understand the extent of this loot. But again, back to the legs. Why are there no legs? And this is a very, very sad story in the most beautiful site of Devgarh. It's today, if you look at Gupta art, Devgarh cannot be, you cannot miss Devgarh. And this huge Varaha, about 8 years ago, the robbers actually cut off, because the leg was anchored. The leg is anchored to this huge slab of stone. The robbers actually broke away the Varaha, the leg. So we need to ask these questions whenever we see museum exhibits and auctions or sales. And this is another Varaha that has been deliberately cut to facilitate illicit smuggling. And you can see that they've basically broken cleanly into parts and then you put together back in the US. And this is how brilliant objects. Here we see in the Sun Temple in Umri, one of the few Sun temples, the head has been cut off by smugglers, and it's on sale, mounted on a stake. Thailand, for example, does not love such, but India has no such rules. We continue, even for decoration, they don't want Buddha's head on a stick. We should pass something similar. So what do we have back home to safeguard? So I just wanted to see the irony. We have this old Nataraj locks saving a Nataraj, and this is, we don't seem to realize we have a problem, and that has been our biggest headache in terms of building awareness. The headline that you're seeing now, 1,000 ancient Hindu idols stolen, actually came out in 1986. This is a headline published in 1986. And it's not me who I'm talking about it. I'm putting across the CAG report. This is not the CAG report. This is another CAG report of 2013. And what it says is shocking. I just want you to look at the bottom part. Let's see if I can zoom it in. Between 1976 and 2001, the dates are very important because this is when the UN statuette comes into force, which we will talk in a while. India brought back 19 antiquities, and from 2001 to 2013, zero. I just give you an example. India and Italy actually jointly campaigned the UN to come up with the UN statuette. Italy actually established a very fine national art squad called the Carbonari Art Squad, and so far they are supposed to record over 138,000 objects. Just look at it compared to India. We brought back till 2013 19 objects, and this 2001 to 2013 is very important, as you see from this story. This is actually an expose done by a British BBC journalist called Peter Watson. If you have Amazon account, please buy this book. It's a shocking tale of how the auction house Sotheby's actually worked with smugglers. Basically, this book deals with Italian artifacts, but then there's one chapter on India. So there was a sting operation done by the journalist. Actually, the guy is supposed to have said on camera, if you want the Taj Mahal, let us know, we'll ship it out in parts. Not only that, Peter Watson named 3 networks, and one of the objects that he disclosed was this 5-ton Varaha. The robbers had actually tied a chain around the legs of the Varaha and yanked it with a truck, breaking its legs out. Currently, it is sitting with a dealer in Switzerland. We are now working with the US Antiquities Coalition to put this out as a most wanted artifact. We are not able to have much success because of the Swiss secrecy laws. Hopefully we will get it back soon. What happened was, Sotheby's used to send their reps to India. They would go on recce trips with our scholars, some smugglers. They would pick and choose the best of Indian art, and then they would be robbed. So this was not some random theft. This was a industrial scale targeted looting. So once this scandal broke out in 1998, Sotheby's sacked their India heads, but India never took any action. These two people actually went and opened their own shop, Forge and Lynch. But what is interesting is, after 3 years, Indian police, by Rajasthan police, raided the house of the notorious smuggler named in the book Vaman Gia. And his farmhouses in Delhi, they found over 800 buried idols. 400 were fake, 438 were original. When they tried to enter his house, he locked the gate and he burnt almost 40 catalogs of Sotheby's and a lot of Polaroid photographs. Despite all this, including this yogini that came back from France, known to have been smuggled by Vaman Gia's gang, India did not manage to prosecute Vaman Gia. Vaman Gia was acquitted in 2013 for want of evidence because, as per his own so-called confession, he had sold 10,000 objects via Sotheby's London. He had a host of 6 friend companies in Switzerland through which he laundered the money, but India never took on to prove it. This is probably the last proverbial lost straw that broke the camel's back. This beautiful Natesa from Badoli, it was a published artifact. The robbers actually made a fake. So what you're seeing here with the hand broken is a fake. The original was stolen. The fake was kept nearby. Dr. Mankodi, our good friend and expert, basically proved that this was not the original. The original was already shipped out to a dealer in London. When Gia was arrested, the dealer got scared, and in 2005 he gave it to the Indian High Commission, where it was on display till last year. When we brought it up to the High Commission, it was finally sent to India. But in 2013, Vaman Gia was released because not one of the so-called 10,000 that he had smuggled out had actually been brought back to India. So that's the bad story. and it continues. It's not just this case. We had two major successes which are like today quoted as India's great successes of restitution in the 1970s and 80s. One was the Norton Simon Nataraja, which is the Sivapuram Nataraja, and the Pattur Nataraja that was from London. I tell you this sad story. The Pattur Nataraja was actually a buried hoard. The farmer had basically stumbled on it and he buried it near his house, near a thermite mound. And it was actually bought by a Canadian company called Bumper Development Corporation. They had sent it to London for cleaning. And the cleaners looked at it and he saw mud and he knew that it was from a buried hoard. He informed Scotland Yard, who in turn informed India, and India went and fought this case in London. A brilliant judgment was given. Experts were called in. The termite mounds basically were compared, and in fact the termites evidence was more compelling. And the court ruled that the temple, even though ruined, had superior claim on the Lord and returned this idol Murti to India. But what happened was India never followed up on this. They never asked Bumper Development Corporation why did they buy this antiquity, what else do they have. In 2014, Bumper Development Corporation went bust, not before donating over 100 objects to the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, and they also tried to auction over 200 artifacts, but because they did not have proper provenance, the public auction didn't go through. So this is another case where India did not follow up with this cases. This is another case. In fact, the Pattur Nataraja had to wait 10 years in customs because the customs had no proper paperwork for a restituted object because there was no record of the export. So they couldn't file the re-import procedure for 10 years. It was stuck in customs. So this is the Glenbow Museum actually displaying the collection donation of the Bumper Development Corporation. Now, Sivapuram Nataraja story is even more sadder. This was 6 bronzes that were found, again buried by a farmer, but he diligently gave it over to the authorities. A Samandar, a Nataraja, a Somaskandar, a Ganesha, and 2 Devis were found. But the temple actually gave it to a Stapati for cleaning. The Stapati made fakes, and please remember in 1957, the Stapati made fakes of all the 6 bronzes. So that means there was a vibrant market even in the 1960s. The original was sent via collector Lansdane, and Lansdane was so there's a WikiLeaks page on this as well. What is interesting is in 1960 the British King and Queen visited Chennai and this book was published, and Lansdane, who actually bought this Murti, was in charge of bringing out this volume, and he had the audacity to put it on the back cover. And our people were so stupid and foolish that they were still worshipping the fakes in the temple, not realizing the original was already in Bombay. By the time the British Museum curator came down to look at the bronzes in the temple, Douglas Barrett, he said, no, these are fakes, the original are with a dealer in Bombay. By the time the police could go to Bombay, Lansdane had already sold it to another dealer in London. Incidentally, Lansdane died in 2012. But what was interesting was Norton Simon bought it for $1 million in 1960s. Not only that, there was this publication that was done by P.N. Srinivasan where you see the buried as it was brought out, the Somaskanda. The Somaskanda is still on display in Norton Simon Museum with a provenance plate reading Sivapuram, acquisition year 1972. When there is an FIR in Tamil Nadu, it still says only the Nataraja came back, there is no news of the balance 5 items. What is interesting is India signed an out-of-court settlement with Norton Simon. It said Norton Simon would keep this Nataraja for 10 years in a public museum and then return it to India. He will lose his $1 million. But then there was a second clause which said Norton can acquire any object of Indian art for a period of 1 year provided it is already out of India. We will not ask any questions. So this moratorium, basically Norton Simon laundered almost 800 Indian objects into his museum, of which there are many such. So these are all the fakes. And what is interesting is even at that time when India knew that there were this fakery going on, there was no checks done in any temple. Recently, about 2 years ago, we found this Tirumangai Alvar, a saint of Shiva, of Vishnu, currently in the Oxford Museum in Ashmolean, Oxford. What you see with the blue background is a fake in the temple. The original is now promised to return by Ashmolean. Not only that, the same temple we went and checked last year, there are 6 fakes. The originals are all in museums in Europe and America. There's another strange case. I'll take another 10 minutes. Is that okay, Anko?
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay.
Okay. So this was another interesting case, beautiful Nataraja from Thiruvellikudi, that was returned by US Museum. Incidentally, they had bought it from a London dealer. This is the archival photograph when you were still in the temple. What is interesting is Tamil Nadu police along with Scotland Yard raided the gallery in London in 1986. There they found 141 idols. They raided his house, they found 41 more. Only one of the idols that this gallery had sold, the Everest Art Gallery had sold to the Kimball Museum in America, was returned. There is, so this 240, so basically from the shop they nabbed 240 and from his house 41. 281 idols were seized in London in 1986, and then the paper trail is missing. Tamil Nadu police does not have any details, nor does Scotland Yard. The entire file is missing. So we have a lot of such cases. We can just keep going on, and we've seen beautiful movies that are being sold. Including the Narangs, who actually were into another 10 years later. The Narangs farmhouses were raided in Delhi and Bombay. Again, we found a lot of bronzes stolen, sent out. Nothing happened. So that's been the case with India. Photo ops, high profile, one restriction, no follow up. Having said that, I wanted to just introduce the international laws before we end today's session, and then we continue what we've done. So you're going to see till 2013, and then next session you will see what happened post 2013. So as I told you, this was actually a paper to UNSCR by India and Italy, a joint paper, and you can actually see the police at that point of time had state-wise reported thefts of art and archaeology. So you see 1969, 1970, 1971, 72. Those days they were actually reporting thefts by state, and today we don't even know if this data ever exists. And even that, they go whether it's a theft or a burglary, such breakup was available, and this was actually tabled in the UN to come up with the paperwork for the UNESCO convention. So everybody talks about the 1970 UN statute. For starters, instead of just going into too much detail, it basically says that the country should have a very good patrimony law. So India brought in the Antiquities Act in 1972, which was passed by Parliament in 1977. So basically what it says is any signatory to this act, to this statute, you need to educate your people, you need to publicize art thefts. If you find an object that's been stolen from your side and you have in situ proof that it was stolen after 1970, you have to send a notice to the destination country. They have 30 days to refute. If they cannot prove otherwise, the artifact is forfeit to you. So it's just restitution. It doesn't mean that if it's pre-1970 it somehow washes everything. Before 1970 we have to go and prove the theft. If it's after 1970 you just send it using the UN statute. That's the basic thing. So this is a convention. It's again not retrospective. One of the biggest omissions, they couldn't get countries to sign a retrospective act, so it is only post 1970. In terms of the UNDROID convention of 1995, it goes a step ahead because it covers not only state artifacts, also private personal collections. But again, it is also not retrospective, and India has not signed the UNDROID convention. We're going to see a little bit of paperwork in terms of what provenance is. Provenance is like your mother parent document. We'll see that we need this for next session. So I'm just putting this up so you have time. You can review the video once it's up. So what is considered a good provenance? So most dealers are quite smart. They will publish an advertisement in Arts of Asia or a collector's magazine, or they will loan it to a museum for a special exhibition, or they would give it to a hotel to display, thereby gaining good provenance. They'll say it's already exhibited for 10 years and all that. We'll see all that. Restitution is definitely not a gift. Restitution is so you can gift what you own. You don't own an object that's been stolen. India's Antiquity Act, it's very simple. Anything over 100 years has to be registered. Once it's registered, it cannot be exported. It can be freely sold within India through a licensed dealer. The only thing, within 30 days he has to register the sale within India. So it's simple. Whenever you register an antiquity, the registering officer has to conduct an inquiry. So you just can't walk on the road, pull hero stone or something that's on the road and bring it home and register. You need to take it to ASI to convince him that how is it that you came up with the artifact. So this is the form. I strongly recommend any collectors who are reading this to register their artifacts. Okay, I leave you with 2 more minutes. This is a role of experts, because I did mention there are sold experts. This is a renowned French scholar called Dubriol, who did a lot of pioneering work in South India on Buddhist and Pallava sites. Dubriol basically was an agent for a renowned art smuggler Chinese called C.T. Lu in Paris. And this is what he did. These were amazing yoginis from Kaveri Pakkam near Kanchipuram. And this is what he did. He spirited them to Pondicherry, and from Pondicherry he exported it all over the world to C.T. Lu, and C.T. Lu sold it all over the world. So if you want to read more about these yoginis, look for Padma Kaimal's book, The Dispersed Yoginis. But not only that, C.T. Lu and Dubriol actually sold over 200 objects, including some famous Natarajas world over. Recently, there was a British-Thai dual passport dealer, scholar, Nexus, Douglas Latchford and Emma Bunker. Their books are published. He is no longer, he died about a few months ago. And what you're seeing here is his house, and you can actually see in Bangkok, he's standing in front of a Chola Somaskanda. There's a lot of provenance work that he is linked to. A lot of our experts have been certifying objects. Here you can see how Subhash Kapoor sold to National Gallery of Australia with expert opinions by our own, some celebrated Lotus awarded scholars. We'll also see that the Nataraja that we talked about in a while, we'll see that in the next session. It was done by an expert. This again is Nataraja that was basically certified by a director of archaeology, saying it is not stolen. So a lot of these, and this is a beautiful Chola signet ring whose provenance reads, it's very interesting, it's basically Assistant Epigraphist, Archaeological Survey of India. So a lot of such objects are going off. I'm going to end on a very sad note. I'll end on a happy note. This was a success that we had in 2017. This Brahma Brahmini was stolen from Gujarat, Rani Ki Vav. Dr. Manpudi has put out this lookout notice, and we spotted it in a sale in a dealer in London. We wrote to the ASI. The ASI flew in an expert from India to London to view the object, and he said it's not the same. He said both of them are not the same, and returned the object to the dealer. We objected to it, and we asked them to give us the inspection report. And what was interesting was his inspection report by the so-called expert of ASI. He says the original image, which was taken in 1970, there was no incrustation because there was no sand when the object was shown to them in London. Obviously they cleaned it. In the face of the Brahma is fresh and sharper compared to a photo he's seeing in front. He says the face of Brahma looks more serene, again objective, but the fourth one which is where we all really literally cried blood. He says the fingers of the upper hand of the Brahma were broken in the image that he was shown in London, but whereas in the original they were intact, which is classic junk, because obviously when they transported it, when they smuggled it, the finger broke. If the converse were true, if in the original the finger was broken in this object, if it was so, we objected to it. We gave them the proof, and then what happened was we got this amazing letter from ASI saying they had constituted an expert committee and they took our word, and basically the Brahma Brahmani was brought back, and it's currently now in the Purana Kila Restituted Art Museum, but of course with no names of mine and Dr. Manpadi mentioned, but the name of the transporter who brought it from the dealer to the ASA office is named. So they basically wanted to hide the dealer's name, but we are putting it out for you guys to see. This was the dealer who was trying to sell the object. Not only that, we are talking about stone chariots that are coming up for sale. And this beautiful South Indian stone chariot amazingly was put on offer for 96 lakh rupees in Bombay, with an expert who certified it as 95 years old. Wood cannot be dated, so I don't know how he gave. So basically he gave less than 100 years to beat the ASI registration mandate. Not only that, we are seeing a lot of temple jewelry that's coming up for sale. I mentioned about intermediaries. I'll just end with this. So here we see, this was the Sri Puradan Nataraja that was bought by the National Theatre of Australia for $5.1 million. You can actually see the color when it was under worship. It was actually sent to a restaurant in London who applied chemicals to give it a fake patina as though it is a buried hoard. Because buyers think if it's a buried hoard, there will be no questions asked. So even they cheat. So a lot of such work is done by restorers going against the very basic of conservation. Here you see a buried hoard, and the restorer basically has repaired, cleaned, given it a new leg. He should very well know that it is banned for export, and a lot of this is happening. Can this be solved at origin? I stop at this point. So yes, it can be done, and we will see that in the next session, which we will be announcing shortly. I'm free to take any questions. Thank you.
First question is from Muthu Suruli, and the question is, great job, Vijay. What can we or the government do to put in measures to prevent such large-scale loot?
I would say just three things that need to be done. One is documentation. Again, I'd like you to wait for the next session to show how we have proved and got idols back. The main and probably the only proof is creating a proper archive. What we lack across India is that most temples have a fear that if you take photographs, the power of the god will go, which is untrue. Maybe it's a nuisance if everybody starts taking photos, but every institution, every temple should at least have a proper archive. One copy should be given to the local police station, one copy should be filed with the Central Archaeology. If you have photographs, I can show an example. Again, I'm going to do that in the next session. I don't want to break. A documented antiquity becomes unsellable in the open market. I'll show you examples of how it is there. So I think the first and foremost thing is to document it. Number two, India has to become strong. For example, for too long have we been silent players. In fact, we've bought back a lot of objects. All of them are designated as voluntary returns. At next session, you will see none of them are voluntary. India tries to put it as voluntary. Whereas, for example, I take Italy's example. Italy says, this is an Italian artifact. You are selling it. Prove it to us that you have got it legally. Whereas India takes the other way. The burden of proof rests on us. So we need to dig through tons of data, go back 100 years to find source photographs. Whereas in Italy, it just stops the sale and says, you hold the object, you are the owner, show you have right title. So I think it needs a little bit of change. And lastly, I think the collecting lobby cabal has been very actively working with the agencies. In fact, The Antiquities Act is a toothless act. In fact, there is no penalizing provision. The only penalty in the Antiquities Act is a 6-month penalty if you can prove that you knowingly did not register an antiquity. But then there is no other provision. Lastly, what do? Is they either file on IPC section 380 or under Customs Act. Under Customs Act, you need to have shown proof of export. IPC section 380 is basically housebreaking theft. So there is technically no legal provision in India for heritage crimes. And the worst thing is the maximum penalty under IPC section 380 housebreaking theft is 6 years, 6 to 7 years. And even worse is in Tamil Nadu in 1993 they issued a state amendment that basically said IPC section 380 stays, but if it is theft from a temple, the maximum penalty is 3 years. So that means in Tamil Nadu, if you steal from a house, the maximum penalty is 7, but if you steal from a temple, it's only 3. So we need to really relook at our, these 3 are very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijayji. The next question is from Subramanian Kanan, and he's asking, is there a formal system put in place now by the government to start working with museums abroad to recover the lost idols?
No, I would sadly say no, not yet. We are receiving when they are given back, but I would say that we still need a more robust system. Because the time delays are too much. In fact, to put things in perspective, when Prime Minister Modi visited, which we're going to see next session, in the US in June of 2016, he was promised 200 artifacts, of which only 7 have come back so far. It's been 5 years since. So yeah, we need the government to be more proactive to put on a more formal system. Italy, for example, is willing to provide the technical know-how. They have the best of their legal team, they have best of image recognition software, they have best of their archival systems which they're willing to share. But sadly, the momentum is missing from India's side.
Thank you, Vijayji. The next question is from Suresh Kumar, asking, excellent work, Mr. Vijay. What do you think is the main cause for lack of awareness about the temple arts and artifacts?
I think for one generation, we did not have a safety net, and we've all been chasing money and jobs. But I think now, at least in the last decade, I've seen a lot of interest back into our heritage awareness. I am very, very optimistic that things will change. But what hurts me is, for example, if somebody picks your pocket or grabs a chain on the road, a whole mob runs around him and whacks the shit out of him and takes back. And here people are stealing our gods and openly auctioning them. That kind of hurt doesn't seem to register. So I'm at a loss to explain this. But there are very, very positive signs. In fact, next session I'll show you actual footage of the returning gods, where the whole village turns up to receive their gods back. So I think there is still hope, and I think with the EU and the US realizing the terrorism link and also the money laundering link, the US in fact is coming up with a very, very strict regulation on money laundering, linking it to art crime. So I think if not to India, the market, at least the open markets, are going to stop. And Australia, for example, we've managed to get back so many from Australia, but Australia government has told Australian museums, please don't buy any Indian art henceforth. So I think so that is kind of the deterrent that we were. But basically, my request to you is please go back to your ancestral villages whenever you have a holiday. Right now, international travel is not happening, so go back to your villages, go back to your Kuladevatas and Devams, and just take a look at them. And when you go in, just go straight down to the deity, put your request, and come back. Spend some time going around it. If you request some basic cleaning on a weekend, arrange for some basic cleaning. It's ours. It's a sacred duty. It's not our own. It's our duty to preserve and pass on to the next generation. And I think we should not rely on the government for everything. and please report thefts. I'll show you examples where we've solved crimes from 1962, 1961. So in fact, if any of you go back to your village, or if you hear something has been stolen many years ago, don't think it's a gone case. We can definitely get back stolen items. Thank you, Suresh.
Thank you, Vijay. The next question is from Chitra Gopi. Oh, sorry. The next question is from Sumati ji. He's asking, it's a heart-wrenching story to see the so-called gods. Even today, we see reports on social media of antique found buried in different
So
places.
actually,
Is
what
there
is happening is there is the Indian Treasure Trove Act of 1878, which basically says anything above 10 rupees buried under the ground belongs to the crown. And later independence, the crown was changed to the government. So anything above 10 rupees that is found under the ground belongs to the government. So I think it has to change a bit. I'm not saying it should become like the UK treasure trove. So what we have actually suggested to various governments is to come up with a form of incentivizing the finders, because most of the cases that we have studied, the actual finder gets paid just the weight of the metal. It gets transferred 4 or 5 times among middlemen, and then the price gets into the millions. So these subsistence people, farmers who find it, get paid like 2,000, 4,000 rupees for the weight. So if there is some form wherein the government can reward, so maybe call them for the Independence Day parade, give them an award, a plaque. When it's displayed in a museum, for example, these finds, just put the finder's name so that there's a sense of pride of contributing. I think these are creative ways in which we can encourage finders to disclose such finds. But yes, the problem exists. Even today, every month we find a lot of such buried ones. I would say even 5% are not reported. The rest are being smuggled out.
Thank you, Vijay. The next question is from Gopinath. Are these thefts done along with police, management and government authorities, and what is the punishment meted out to them?
Well, I would say that our job as researchers or enablers is to ensure awareness building, find matches. So I'll show you how a volunteer team works. In terms of actual criminals, finding the actual criminals, it's up to law enforcement to do. But the sad thing is, as I explained to you, the harsh penalties are missing, and the incentives runs into crores of rupees. So this is a deadly combination. So on one side, we have to act as a deterrent, stopping. It's like, say, wildlife trafficking. When the buying stops, the killing stops. But there are no harsh penalties also. So I think India has to relook at its own penal system. We need to have a special law for heritage crimes. Unless that happens, I think the penalties are too little, too less compared to the rewards